Hello and good morning, and welcome to the final day of the News on the Block Leasehold Knowledge Week. A big thank you to our sponsors for this week: Chandler Harris, Pearly Gate Maintenance, BBIS Commercial Heating, Foresight, Realty Law, Blackguard Insurance, JPC, Towergate Insurance Brokers, and PLP Fire Protection for their support this week. Now, in our first session today, we are going to be discussing the very important topic of residential fire update and some considerations on cost recovery. We've invited one of our most popular speakers today to tackle this topic, Cassandra Zanelli, solicitor and CEO of Property Management Legal Services Limited. Cassandra is widely recognised for her expertise in the industry. Among her industry-related qualifications, she's a member of the IRPM, an associate of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. She's a member of the ARMA Advisory Panel and honorary consultant to the Federation of the Private Residents Association. She's a regular speaker at conferences, events and seminars, having worked with leading organisations, ARMA, IRPM, RICS and the Leasehold Advisory Service. A leading authority in the first tier tribunal, she's regularly called upon to represent her national client base. Now, she's going to be here until 11 o'clock today, so please use the Q&A function. She's going to take questions throughout the whole session, so please make the most of her time. So without further ado, Cassandra, good morning. How are you today?
Good morning. Hello. Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm very well indeed. I'm looking forward to your session, very popular. Without further ado, I'm going to hand straight over to you, and I have said, please put questions in the Q&A button at the bottom. You're happy to answer anything that you can.
Absolutely, absolutely. I fear after that introduction as well, which was fantastic, by the way, Charlotte, thank you. I fear that I may disappoint people now, but hopefully
you never
not.
Disappoint. You never disappoint. Don't worry. Right.
No pressure.
I'll see you later.
Thank you. Right, guys, let me try and deal with the, here we go. Been able to work out how to swap slides, although it's now not letting me again. Do you know, slides are the work of the devil. So as Charlotte says, Cassandra Zanelli, solicitor and chief exec at the recently launched, although it feels like a little time ago now, Property Management Legal Services Limited. So thank you very much to News on the Block for inviting me along to speak to you guys today. And thank you to you guys for tuning in to hear all about the residential fire safety update. There is an absolute boatload of stuff that I could talk to you about in relation to fire safety and what's happening with fire safety. And I never know whether this is a threat or a promise. I mean, answers on a postcard rather. But I could talk to you for days in relation to fire safety and what's happening. And we only have an hour or so together this morning. So what I've done is that I've picked out probably the most common questions that I am getting asked at the moment, either by managing agents or landlords or RMC directors. I appreciate that there is a heck of a lot more that we could talk about, but I've chosen what seemed to me to be the issues that you guys are facing at the moment. So we'll go through and look at issues in relation to qualifying works. So whether certain things are caught by Section 20 or not. We'll have a look at EWS 1, particularly in line with cost recovery, because there's a cost recovery theme to what I'm talking to you about this morning. We'll have a look at the ping pong that's been going on with the fire safety bill and its cost recovery based because of the amendments that are being proposed and then pretty much rejected by government when it goes back to the Commons. And then we'll have a look at building safety charges to give you a flavour of what building safety charges are all about. Those seem to be the common issues that you guys are facing, and we'll deal with troubleshooting as well at the end. So that's really a catch-all for any questions that you've got. As we're going through, please do shout up with any questions that you have, and then I can take a look at those and answer them, hopefully, as we go. So please do shout up. Let's start by looking at a question that seems to be crossing my desk an awful lot, and I have a huge amount of sympathy for managing agents at the moment, because you are there are some challenges that you guys as managing agents have, and no doubt you feel that you are spending a heck of a lot of time dealing with fire safety and fire safety related stuff. Cold comfort, but I'm spending an awful lot of my time dealing with fire safety related things as well, whether it's advising on whether who's responsible for certain things on a block, how costs are recovered, through to dealing with tribunal determinations, dispensations, and even appointment to manager related stuff for fire safety. So I feel your pain. But one of the things that seems to be coming up a lot is whether Section 20 is triggered by surveys and by professional fees. So whether it's necessary to undertake consultation or obtain dispensation from consultation where we're dealing with surveys, assessments, professional advice, that kind of thing. So we'll start by looking at Section 20 itself, and you have the extract there on your slide. So Section 20 is one of the statutory limitations on the recovery of service charges. You'll all be really familiar with Section 20 and these statutory limitations, and basically where you have qualifying works or a qualifying long-term agreement, then the contributions of lessees are limited unless you have either consulted in accordance with the consultation regs, or you have gone to the tribunal, FTT if you're in England, LVT if you're in Wales, and asked the tribunal to dispense with consultation. Section 20, very familiar to you all, because you will be going through Section 20 exercises on a frequent basis, particularly in the current climate. And we talk about, when we're talking about Section 20, we talk about it in common parlance in terms of major works, but it's actually qualifying works. And qualifying works is defined by Section 20ZA subsection 2 as meaning works on a building or other premises. So the question that comes up an awful lot is it necessary to consult or obtain dispensation from consultation where those costs relate to professional advice and or surveys, assessments, that kind of thing? I'll pause a moment there, let you have a think about that and see what your answer to that question might be. We have the 1985 Act, Landlord and Tenant Act 1985 Act, and it's Section 20 of the 1985 Act. So that's been around, it's nearly as old as me. But it got amended by the Common Hold and Leasehold Reform Act 2002. What we have where we're dealing with qualifying works and whether there is a differentiation between qualifying works in terms of works versus services is that we have a case from pre-CLARA, so pre-Common Hold and Leasehold Reform Act 2002. So the meaning of qualifying works was considered, but it's not being considered under the regulations and under Section 20 as it looks now, post-amendment, and the consideration predated those amendments. So we don't have anything new. We have as it was under the 85 Act before the 2002 Act came in and made some amendments to it. But what you have on the slide is an extract from a decision in a case called Marionette Limited. It's Marionette and Visible Information Package Systems Limited. And this is a quote directly from that case. And in that case, the Lands Tribunal, as it was, said that works are, in my judgment, restricted to the physical works involved in repair or maintenance, and the cost of those works is a charge made by the contractor carrying out those works for doing so. This is also very much the flavour given by subsection 4C that we're dealing with, the old 85 Act, requiring a description of the works to be carried out, to be given in the notice which has been served on the tenants. That provision to me seems to be inapposite to cover professional services provided by an independent person as part of the works which need to be described. So what Marionette is saying is that reports don't amount to works, but they amount to a service. And a service is different in its nature from a physical activity that requires alteration, amending, or repair to the fabric of the building. As I say, this is a case under the 85 Act as was before it was amended, but this is something that I am quoting quite a bit when I'm involved in tribunal cases, which deal with high levels of report fees, because there are some quite expensive reports being undertaken at the moment. And in the tribunal cases I've been involved in, the tribunal is accepting that there is that conceptual difference between works as compared to a service, and the tribunals are saying that therefore it's not necessary to consult and or obtain dispensation from the consultation requirements where you're dealing with surveys and professional advice. It does come, and I stress it comes with a caveat, that this is a case based on the 85 Act prior to the amendments that brought about by the 2002 Act, but it's the case that lots of lawyers are using and are relying on at the moment. So hopefully that helps a little bit where you're dealing with the quandary as to whether it's necessary to go through the consultation process or to go to the tribunal and obtain dispensation from consultation, where you're dealing with reports and surveys. And I appreciate that those reports and surveys can be rather expensive and rather costly in the current climate. It's important to remember as well that leaseholders retain their Section 19 protections, and Section 19, of course, is all to do with reasonableness of service charges. So just because you might not need to go and get dispensation or go through consultation, leaseholders can still challenge the costs. Either they may say that the costs are not a service charge recoverable item under the lease, so challenge on liability, and they retain their ability to challenge on grounds of reasonableness as well. Again, something you'll be familiar with, that Section 20 deals with one aspect, so it deals with the limitation, but there are still other aspects to be dealt with as well. Just looking and seeing whether anybody has any questions in relation to that. There's none that have come in at the moment. I assume therefore that everybody is comfortable and happy with Section 20. Marie says, what year was the case? I've not written that down, Marie. Off the top of my head, I think it's a 2001 case, although I could be wrong. I'll come back to you in relation to that. Yeah, if you Google it, you'll be able to find it. Thank you. Ross says 2002 is beat me to it. Right, let's see if I can move on to the next slide. Next. Sorry, technical issues. Trying to multitask and failing miserable. The next question that I get asked an awful lot is about EWS1 and who pays for the EWS1 forms. And I thought it would be useful, just as a bit of background and to get us in the mood for EWS1, to talk about how we've got to where we are with the EWS1 form. If you haven't come across the new guidance note yet, and I assume that you have, but if you haven't, I've put in the slide the link to the new guidance note issued by RICS. And that new guidance note is effective from the 5th of April. So that's from a couple of weeks' time now, isn't it? We're nearly April. The note does say that earlier adoption is encouraged in relation to the guidance note. And I thought it would be useful to have on your slides really where we're coming from with this EWS1 form, because the guidance note, as I've quoted there, is not intended to be, nor should it be used as a substitute for or part of a professional life safety risk assessment of any building. The EWS1 form is not a safety certificate, and the fact that an EWS1 form might not be required for a particular building doesn't necessarily mean that that building might not require some form of remediation in the future. The guidance is purely to help valuers understand when an EWS1 form is required due to visible cladding, and is likely under current guidance issued by the government that remedial works affecting the values of the property would be needed to remedy any defects with that cladding. So your EWS1 isn't your suitable and sufficient risk assessment. It is it's there for valuation purposes and for lending purposes. So there is that conceptual difference when we're dealing with EWS1. And I think that that is probably something that will have an impact in due course when the upper tribunal get their hands on an EWS1 case to see whether the costs are reasonably incurred or not. That I think is a challenge that has yet to work its way to the upper tribunal. In terms of background then, how we ended up here, we have in January 2020, the government publishing their advice for building owners of multi-storey, multi-occupied residential buildings, which is the consolidated advice note that you will be familiar with. And you have the additional supplement to that came out in November of last year. And that advice note outlines the advice of the MHCLG's Independent Expert Advisory Panel on building safety for owners of domestic residential blocks of flats following Grenfell and other fires in buildings within England. And in that advice note, it's paragraph 1.5 that advises that there is a need to assess and manage the risk of external fire spread across buildings of any height. When we have the fire safety bill, and we'll look at fire safety bill in a moment, when that comes into force, which was expected in spring, then there's going to be a requirement for building owners of multi-storey, multi-occupied buildings in England to undertake fire risk appraisals and assessments of their buildings, which is going to include an assessment of the external wall system. And what the RICS guidance note says is that the purpose of mortgage valuation, as set out in the RICS global standards, includes providing an assessment of market value for a property. And if I quote from the guidance, it says, "A valuation is not a fire or life safety assessment. Valuers will not be competent or insured to assess the composition of cladding or any other attachments to a building, nor will the non-intrusive inspection that a valuer is usually instructed to carry out allow for such an assessment. The valuer will make an assumption under the existing valuation standards that no deleterious or hazardous materials have been used in construction. However, a valuer will need to carefully consider whether the presence of cladding or balconies on a multi-storey, multi-occupancy residential building is an obvious potential hazard that may materially affect the value of the property and its saleability. If the valuer considers that the presence of cladding or balconies may materially affect the value of the property, they would need further information before making a valuation. This may include specialist input from a competent expert on the composition of any cladding or attachments and the likelihood the building will require remedial work." So that's a quote from the guidance. And the guidance goes on to say EWS1 was designed as a means of ensuring that a suitable assessment had been carried out by a competent fire expert to provide information about whether remedial works are likely to be required for a building. It is intended for use in valuation only, not as a fire risk assessment, and provides a simple and clear pro forma which lenders and valuers can assess whether there is a need for remedial works which will affect value. This enables lenders and valuers to provide the best advice to those wishing to access finance and wishing to make purchasing decisions. So the guidance is really clear about what EWS1 is and what it's intended to do and what it's not, because there is often some confusion. And I thought it would be useful to show you just a quick table about the number of residential buildings that are affected or potentially affected by this. So you have that table there. And that is from the Building Safety Programme, Estimates of EWS1 Requirements on Residential Buildings in England. And that was updated on the 8th of March, so just a couple of weeks ago. So who pays? We know from a report in June of last year that at least 860 EWS1 forms had been completed by that point, have been completed by June. And RICS told us that in a press release that they put out following a local government committee report in June of last year. And they say without EWS, mortgage finance would have been unobtainable. Then we look at what do we know about who's paying, and one of the things that we know is from the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee report that was published on the 12th of June of last year. And that highlighted the observation that high costs, or there were high costs, are high costs for EWS1 surveys, and that the costs of those surveys seem to be getting passed on to residents. And what they said in their report was this: they said that we heard that the cost of these surveys, which are often passed to residents, can be very high. Surveys are more likely to be intrusive, perhaps over a large proportion of the building, which is expensive in terms of time and cost. It was reported, one example of a block where £1 million had been spent on obtaining an EWS survey, which had ultimately revealed to have no fire safety defects at all. Of course, where defects are found through the EWS1 process, remedial works will be required, as well as a final survey once those have been completed. It goes on to say, and acknowledging creating delays for residents. So what it seems, from what I hear and from what I read, is that the costs of the EWS1 form are washing through the service charges. So they are being recovered as a service charge payable by lessees who have to contribute under the service charge mechanism set down by their lease. We haven't as yet had any cases in the upper tribunal which deal with that. I suspect that those will be coming, and I suspect that there will be some reasonableness challenges from lessees who argue that the costs were unreasonable. Perhaps from lessees who haven't got a mortgage, so don't need the EWS1 for mortgaging purposes, and perhaps from lessees who aren't intending to sell, so it doesn't affect them. I can see the arguments. But as it stands, it seems that the costs are going through service charges and being recouped from leaseholders via the service charge mechanism in the lease. So it's probably worth reminding you guys that there are two key considerations when you're dealing with cost recovery in relation to service charge. Firstly, the thing that you are looking for is to make sure that your lease allows for that certain cost item to be recovered via the service charges. So is there a cost heading in your lease that says that you can recover the costs of EWS1? No doubt you are all, when you're putting your budgets together for the start of the year, you will have your budget in one hand, you will have your lease in the other, and you will compare and contrast. So when you are looking at something, I don't know, recovery of costs for window cleaning that's in your budget, you are then looking to your lease to make sure that there's a clause in your lease that enables you to recover that cost via the service charge. Same for EWS1. Is there a clause in your lease that enables you to recover that cost via the service charge? But that's only the first question. The second question is whether it's reasonably, whether such costs are reasonably incurred, whether the decision to incur those costs is a reasonable one. And as more cases, as I say, wash through the courts and tribunals, then we'll perhaps have some more guidance from the tribunals as to how they're going to approach these high cost, and the example that you have, £1 million spent on an EWS survey, which is a huge amount of money, isn't it? So keep your eye out for any decisions of the upper tribunal in relation to the costs associated with EWS 1 forms. Haven't had any yet. It seems to be going through the service charges, but keep your eye out for any changes or developments in that area. I will move on to the fire safety bill. And I suspect that many of you are tuning in this afternoon to hear Sean Lundy talk about fire safety bill and talk about the building safety bill. So I won't cross over too much with what Sean is going to talk to you about this afternoon. The two pieces of legislation that are working their way through Parliament at the moment is the fire safety bill and the building safety bill. There are differences between them. They both do different things, but it's important to remember that the fire safety bill applies to any building containing 2 or more sets of domestic premises, so that applies across the board, whereas the building safety bill applies to buildings in scope. So fire safety bill is going to apply to your portfolios. Building safety bill is only going to apply to certain parts of your portfolios that are within scope, so 18 metres or 6 stories. I wanted to make that distinction before we talk about them. And the fire safety bill was supposed to be for the purposes of clarifying and amending the fire safety order, so the Regulator Reform Fire Safety Order of 2005. It's taken a slightly different turn because of amendments that are ping-ponging at the moment between the Lords and the Commons. But the purpose of the bill itself, which was supposed to come into force in spring, was to clarify, firstly, that any building containing 2 or more sets of domestic premises, that the order applied to any building containing 2 or more sets of domestic premises, to the building structure and external walls and common parts, including front doors of residential areas. So resolving this flat front door issue that I know is a massive issue. It also, Fire Safety Bill, clarifies that references to external walls in the order include doors or windows in those walls and anything attached to the exterior of those walls, including balconies. So it was there to clarify, because it recognised that there are some grey areas in the fire safety order. So Building Safety Bill designed to clarify those grey areas. And the amendments to the fire safety order brought about by the fire safety bill aim to increase enforcement action in these areas, particularly where remediation of ACM cladding is not taking place. So far, so good. And it's worth kind of having in mind the scale of this problem and the scale of this problem with our buildings, and not just how many buildings are affected by this, but also how much it's going to cost to put our buildings right. And I'm sure that everybody watching this has, horror stories about what percentage of their portfolio is affected by this and how much it's going to cost to put that right. You have an extract from the report in June of last year saying, we believe there is no reason to fund the remediation of some fire safety defects, but not others. Our view is that funding will need to be increased to address all fire safety defects in every high-rise or high-risk residential building, potentially costing up to £15 billion. Wow. You then have a quote from government saying that the government is clear and unwavering in its view that it is unacceptable for leaseholders to have to worry about the costs of fixing historic safety defects in their buildings that they didn't cause. And that's the whole debate that's going on at the moment, isn't it, is to who should pick up the tab for this. It's clear that there's a tab to be picked up. You have the quote there from the report back in June, 15 billion. That's for high rise, high risk residential buildings. What about the rest of our buildings? And it's a question, isn't it, as to who picks up the tab for that, who pays. So the fire safety bill started off live with its first reading on the 19th of March of last year. It had its second reading on the 29th of April, reached committee stage on the 25th of June, report stage on the 7th of September. So it was working its way through the Commons, and it passed through the House of Commons without amendment on the 7th of September. And having worked its way through the Commons, it then goes to the House of Lords. And the House of Lords, their consideration of the bill, that was completed on the 24th of November. And they passed the bill, the fire safety bill, back to the Commons with a number of amendments. There were 5 amendments in total. And one of those amendments, and this is probably the one that's attracted the most attention, was an amendment that would restrict the passing on of remediation costs to leaseholders. That's the one that you will have heard about and read about in the news. And that amendment that the House of Lords sent back to the Commons was then supplemented by further proposed amendments in the Commons on the same issue. And you will probably have heard about the McPartland-Smith amendments. And this is all to do with ongoing concern about leaseholders having to pay for the remediation costs and how much this is going to cost leaseholders if they do have to pay for the remediation costs. So the amendment was essentially a bar on the building owner passing remediation costs onto leaseholders. So the amendment told us who wouldn't pay, but what it didn't do is that it didn't tell us who would pay. Commons accepted 2 of the 5 amendments that the House of Lords had proposed, but it rejected the others, and it rejected the amendment that related to remediation costs. So that proposed amendment that would bar building owners from passing on remediation costs to leaseholders. And it went back up to the House of Lords. And the House of Lords had a further look at this on the 17th, and then sent it back to the Commons, and sent it back to the Commons again, saying, we still want this to be amended, and we want it to be amended so that the remediation costs can't be passed to leaseholders. Some of you will have tuned in to see the debate that took place on 22nd, so Monday of this week, Tuesday of this week, losing track of the days. So it was back in the Commons earlier this week, and the Commons again rejected these proposed amendments. So there has been a huge amount of toing and froing between the Commons and the Lords about these amendments, but what was supposed to be a clarificatory bill that clarified certain things that the fire safety order apply to, there have been amendments sought to it that relate to who pays for the costs of the remediation works. The amendments, as I say, set out or proposed that the building owner couldn't pass those costs on to leaseholders. It didn't deal with the who pays. I suspect that we all have our own views on who could and should be paying for remediation costs. Leaseholders, through no fault of their own, are potentially going to be asked to pay. And certainly for some of those, you have the building safety fund, you have the waking watch fund, you have the ACM fund. They deal with buildings 18 metres plus. You have the 11 to 18 metres where it suggested that there's going to be some loan and government-backed loan that's going to be made in relation to those buildings. Nothing in relation to those that are less than 11 metres. Difficult times, really, isn't it, for our industry, and some political and some moral decisions facing government in relation to recovery of these remediation costs. And no doubt you as agents are getting asked lots about this by your leaseholders, by your RMC directors, by your landlords. Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? I don't know if anybody has any comments in relation to those amendments or anything that they want to to say to them? No, no questions coming in. Okay, I will carry on then. And the last thing, or the last big topic that I wanted to talk to you about today is building safety charges, because I'm getting asked a lot about what's going to happen with cost recovery of building safety charges under the Building Safety Bill. If you rewind a few moments ago, I said, didn't I, that the Fire Safety Bill applies to buildings containing 2 or more domestic premises, so it applies across the board. The Building Safety Bill applies to buildings in scope, or will apply to buildings in scope. So that's buildings 18 metres, 6 stories plus. And under the Building Safety Bill, we have this new concept of building safety charge that's introduced. We're used to dealing with service charges. What you have under the Building Safety Bill is a building safety charge. Service charges and building safety charges are different. Building safety charges aren't service charges. And I've put on the slide really what this is intended to do. So you have an amendment to the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, and you have new clauses inserted to the 85 Act. And those clauses inserted, so you have section 17G to 17X into the 1985 Act concerning building safety charges payable by tenants under long leases of dwellings in high-risk buildings. These establish the concept of a new building safety charge to facilitate transparent recovery of costs incurred by landlords in putting in place building safety measures. The charges will be separate from the service charge so that costs incurred on building safety measures will be readily identifiable and accounted for. So what I thought we'd do is have a look at what all of that means and what it might mean for you guys in practice if you are dealing with these kind of big complex blocks that are going to be caught by the Building Safety Bill. So what the Building Safety Bill does is that it amends the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985 and implies certain terms and certain clauses into leases. And it does this because we all know that leases can be a bit rubbish sometimes in relation to the ability to recover costs. So what it does is that it implies these terms into leases of residential units so that building safety measures, the associated costs and the related charges that may be passed on to leaseholders aren't going to be reliant on the service charge and service charge provisions in each lease, recognising that some leases are better than others, some leases are more deficient than others. So these new statutory implied terms and deal firstly with the landlord and a commitment on the part of the landlord to the leaseholder to carry out the necessary measures, to apply for financial support where that's available, and to observe the statutory requirements in relation to raising charges. You also have a commitment on the part of the leaseholder that will be implied into leases, and that's a commitment to the landlord to pay a fair share of the reasonable charges and to cooperate with the building safety regime. Let's unpack that a little bit more. So under the bill, say we'll amend section 17, and it will allow a relevant landlord by written demand to require a relevant tenant to pay building safety charges to the landlord. And building safety charges are charges in respect of building safety costs, and building safety costs are the costs or estimated costs incurred or to be incurred by or on behalf of an accountable person and for a higher risk building in connection with that person carrying out prescribed building safety measures. and building safety measures are the measures that an accountable person is required by Part 4 of the bill to carry out in relation to the building. And building safety measures is going to include things like the commission and production of the safety case, and I know that Sean's talking about safety case later, so the commission and production of the safety case, resident engagement, and using the mandatory reporting scheme. It's going to cover things such as the appointment of the building safety manager, BSM, that you've probably heard mentioned. It's going to cover the building safety works themselves. It's going to cover the monitoring and management of day-to-day safety in the building, resident engagement, as I say, using those mandatory reporting systems, the cost of compliance with statutory notices, with obligations and requirements, but not any enforcement action that's taken, and fees and other charges that are payable to the regulator. Because what the building safety bill also does is that it changes the regulatory landscape for buildings that are in scope. And the building safety bill, although it allows for these building safety charges to be recovered that are related to building safety measures, it places a raft of obligations and hoops that need to be gone through before those building safety charges are payable. You will be familiar with this because you'll know that there are a raft of hoops to go through in relation to the recovery of service charges. There's a similar raft of hoops to go through in relation to the recovery of building safety charges under the Building Safety Bill. And Section 17H sets out certain obligations on the part of a landlord that they must comply with when they're demanding a building safety charge. So you have to, when you're demanding a building safety charge, give accounting information to the leaseholder. You have to tell them the accounting period you're using. You have to give them a budget setting out what costs you expect to incur as a building safety charge and what their proportion of that is. If you decide to amend your budget partway through the year, you can do that, but you need to tell people that you've done that. And you must give the leaseholders this information. At year end, you are required to undertake a reconciliation and to produce a reconciliation account. And that reconciliation account has to set out the building safety measures that have been carried out. It has to set out what costs have been incurred as a result of carrying out those building safety measures and the amount that leaseholders have paid or would be required to pay in relation to those. The reconciliation account has to explain if there's been any penal action or enforcement action that's been taken and any costs that have been incurred as a result of that. And you need to say as well in that reconciliation account what you've got left at year end. That reconciliation account needs to be given within 28 days of year end, which always surprises and or worries people that they have or will have 28 days to produce that reconciliation account. Your service charge accounts probably take a little bit longer than 28 days to get out, but you have 28 days or will have 28 days from the end of your building safety accounting period to get your reconciliation account out. So far as demanding these are concerned, a leaseholder pays within 28 days of receiving their demand. So they get a demand land on their doormat. They have 28 days to pay that demand for their building safety charge contribution. You can demand at various points, you will be able to demand at various points throughout the year, but you can't demand or won't be able to demand more than once in any 3-month period. So you could have a leaseholder that receives 3, maybe 4 building safety charge demands during a year. You're not confined with what the lease says in relation to that. It's important to note that there is the ability for the leaseholder to withhold payment of a building safety charge, and that relates to things such as if you've not given them the information required or you haven't provided them with the reconciliation account in respect of the previous accounting period. So if you don't give them the information that the bill requires you to give them, then there are or is going to be the ability for the leaseholder to withhold payment of their building safety charges. You will be used when we're dealing with service charges to this concept of reasonableness, because that's one of the statutory restrictions on recovery of service charges. The concept of reasonableness is imported into building safety charges, and we have a new section 17J in respect of that. So the new section 17J will say building safety costs are only payable by a leaseholder to the extent that they are reasonably incurred and were incurred in the provision of services or the carrying out of works, only if those services or works are of a reasonable standard. So that feels quite familiar with what you are used to. I tend to get asked at this point questions about consultation and whether there is a concept of section 20 that's been imported into building safety charges. And yes, it has. So the new section 17K says that in relation to qualifying building safety works or a qualifying building safety agreement, the relevant contribution, so same language, relevant contribution recoverable from a leaseholder as a building safety charge is limited to an appropriate amount, except in 3 circumstances. So except where firstly, the consultation requirements have either been complied with or been dispensed with. Secondly, if it's an urgent case, or thirdly, if the works are carried out or agreement entered into whilst the building is in special measures. The regulator has the ability to appoint a special measures manager, which is similar to kind of the section 24 manager. I have no idea what relevant contribution will be, whether that's the 250 quid that we're stuck with at the moment, so what the appropriate amount will be, whether that's the 250 quid that we have at the moment, or 100 quid if we're dealing with a QLTA, or whether it will be more than that. And I know that there have been lots of comments over the years that really 250 quid is a little bit low and that it ought to be increased. The bill gives the Secretary of State power to make regulations about what the appropriate amount will be. So we'll see whether that mirrors what we have at the moment in the consultation regs, or whether it's going to be a different amount. I don't know what the consultation requirements are going to be. It may be that we have similar to what we have at the moment. It may be that they are different. Again, the bill allows for lots of secondary legislation to come into force, so lots of regulations that will sit alongside and will complement it. As I say, there is the ability to apply to the tribunal for dispensation if the tribunal is satisfied that it is reasonable to do so. So is there a section 20? Yes, but there are 3 ways around it is probably the wrong phrase, but you know what I mean. You either consult or get dispensation, or it's because the works are an urgent case, or the works are being carried out whilst the building is in special measures. You do have, as you have at the moment, section 20B, the 18-month rule, you have something similar and where we're dealing with building safety charges. So unless you notify a leaseholder in writing that costs have been incurred and that they're going to be required to contribute to them by means of payment of a service charge or by means of payment of a building safety charge, then within 18 months of those costs being incurred, then those costs become stale and unrecoverable. So the 18-month rule applies to building safety charges as it does with service charges. You have 18 months from incurring a building safety charge to get a demand out. If you don't get a demand out within 18 months, then those costs become stale and they become unrecoverable. At the moment, the tribunal have ability to determine if a service charge is payable, and if so, by whom, to whom, the amount, the manner, and the date on which those service charges are payable. So an application can be made to the tribunal for those purposes. Same applies with building safety charges, so that the bill allows for an application to be made to the tribunal for a determination as to whether a building safety charge is payable, and if costs were incurred for prescribed building safety measures, whether a building safety charge would be payable for those costs. And in the same way as at the moment, you can apply to the tribunal both when you have incurred costs, so based on your actuals, and you can also go to the tribunal for a predetermination, so based on your estimated costs. You will be able to do the same with building safety charges and go to the tribunal based on your actuals or your anticipated budgeted costs. So that will be the same. Questions come in relation to auditing the service charge or the building safety charge, I think it should say. In the same way that you hold service charge monies in accordance with section 42, so you hold them on trust, then you are going to need to hold your building safety charges in the same way. And at year end, whatever your year might be for building safety charges, then you are going to have to produce that reconciliation account. So Julie, hopefully that assists with your question there. I'm just looking to see what other questions.
Hi, Cass. There's a couple of other questions. Do you want me to call them out for you?
Yeah, let me just, I think I can see them. Bear with. Right. Marie says, would lease stating fire safety costs cover this, or would it be more under professional fees? I assume, Marie, that we're talking about EWS 1, and that's when your question came in, so forgive me that I didn't pick it up until now. You need to look carefully at your lease to see whether you have a clause in your lease that would enable those kind of reports to be recovered. I'm not sure that fire safety and the EWS 1 are necessarily the best of bedfellows because of how or I can certainly see an argument that they're not the best of bedfellows because of how the RICS guidance is written, and the fact that it makes really clear that this is for lending purposes. This isn't your assessment of fire safety and life safety. What I would be looking for in terms of a clause is something that talks about being in the interest of good estate management, or in the interest or costs incurred in the principles of good estate management, something along those lines. Emma says, how will the fire safety bill, including residential flat front doors, work when they say that front doors belong to leaseholders? The fire safety bill makes clear that the fire safety order captures the flat front doors, and the lessees, if the flat front doors are demised to the lessees, are 5354 duty holders under the fire safety order. So as duty holders, they have obligations to all other residents. I'm conscious that Sean will probably deal with that in a lot more information, a lot more detail this afternoon, so I don't want to step on Sean's toes, but yes, the fire safety bill makes clear that flat front doors, because the argument goes that they're part of the means of escape, so it imposes duties on lessees so far as that's concerned. Chris, when do you believe we will have a clear view as to who is to cover the ineligible costs that the Building Safety Fund won't? In which many cases is millions of pounds on leaseholders facing billing tens of thousands, which they can't pay. The reality is that you won't get all paying. Chris, I think that this is a massive issue, and I think that this is one of several massive issues that have yet to be answered, or that we have that we can possibly have an answer to. The Building Safety Fund covers some things, it doesn't cover everything. I'm sure that you have a personal view on it. I have a personal view on it as to what should be happening and who should be paying for these things. If you want to share your personal views on the questions panel, then I'm happy to open up the discussion so far as that's concerned. Josh, hi Josh. Does the building safety charges only relate to the Building Safety Fund, or should any remedial works to a building be demanded separately in this manner? Building safety charges are under Building Safety Bill, and that is not yet enforced, but this is the bill as it's drafted and as it's working its way through Parliament. They will apply to buildings in scope, and buildings in scope are going to be buildings of 18 metres, 6 stories. So in your example of a 10-metre building, then no, it's not going to be caught by the Building Safety Bill, because Building Safety Bill and therefore building safety charges apply to buildings in scope. Emma, I have a zero tolerance policy in items in communal hallways, as that it is, in my view, easier and safer to manage. Residents nearly always push back against this. Do I have any experience of insurers not paying because fine was either caused by items or people couldn't get out due to items in hallways? Again, Sean will talk to you, no doubt, about this afternoon, but you have two ways of dealing with items in communal spaces. You have either a zero tolerance approach to it, or you have a managed approach to it. Have I heard, or in my experience, of insurers not paying? No, but that's doesn't mean to say that it's not happening. It just hasn't come across my radar as yet. So Emma, if you are tuning into Sean this afternoon, then it might be worth flagging that question with him as well, to see whether he has heard of anything. But there are, as I say, those couple of different ways of dealing with stuff in communal hallways. Susan says, presumably that section 20 requirement is again is works, not reports or investigation. Good question. Yes, because the new section 17K, Susan, provides, talks about qualifying building safety works and or a qualifying building safety agreement. So it will depend on whether what you are intending to do is caught as qualifying building safety works or is caught as a qualifying building safety agreement. The language is very similar to what we have with section 20. So a lot of the language that we have for this new building safety charge is familiar to us, because it's what we already have in sections 18 to 30 anyway. Trying to make my screen bigger so that I can see some more questions. Bear with me, guys. Oh, pressing the wrong thing. Yasmin says, hi Cass, in your opinion, if the lease is silent on the recovery of EWS1 costs, where do you think funding will eventually have to come from? I can't see landlords willing to pay. Apologies, I know this would be you just speculating. I think it's worth remembering at this point that, I mean, we all talk about cost recovery and our default is to go to service charges as the way that we recover costs. It's not the only way of recovering costs for a building. And what people seem to be talking about a lot more these days, or with a bit more frequency, is those alternative ways of recovering costs. So you have a residence management company, and the residence management company, for example, has obligations under the tripartite lease. That residence management company is, as well as having obligations under the lease and matters of leasehold management, it's also a corporate entity, and leaseholders, as well as being leaseholders, are also members of that residence management company. So you may have, under the memorandum and articles of association, the ability to raise requisitions on your members. So instead of using the service charge mechanism under the lease from these individuals wearing their leaseholder hat, you use the memorandum and articles of association and corporately raise these monies from those individuals not wearing their leaseholder hat but wearing their member of management company hat. So these are corporate requisitions rather than service charges. And of course, if we're raising the cash and demanding money as a corporate entity from our members, then we don't have to comply with Section 20 and stuff like that because they're not service charges. So one of the ways that you could, if you have a pretty crap lease, one of the ways that you could perhaps look at raising cash and paying for stuff is by using the corporate vehicle rather than necessarily using the leasehold vehicle. That's being explored, in my experience, quite a bit more these days than we have done previously. Hopefully that helps.
Cass, I think we're virtually at the end now. We've just hit 11 o'clock. We've got a couple. Is there any one more question that you'd like to cover before I go goodbye?
Just sorry, I'm getting really old in that I'm having to lean into the screen.
I'm totally the same, so don't worry. I totally get where you're coming from.
Yeah, it
is really tiny.
It is. Do separate accounts need to, let's deal with this one. This is a quick one. Do separate accounts need to be filed with Companies House rebuilding safety charges? No, but you will need to do your reconciliation account at the end of each year, showing what you've spent, what you've had paid to you, and what's left in the pot at the end of it. So there are all sorts of requirements in relation to what your reconciliation account needs to look like, and a reminder that you would have to do that reconciliation account within 28 days of your building safety charge year end.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you so much, Cass, for your time today. Really, really appreciate it. I mean, it is a monumental topic, and there is absolutely no way anyone can cover that in an hour, but I think you've done a great job. So thank you so much. We will send your contact details, and we will send you a copy of the presentation to all of the attendees today. So that's great. We have Dr. Sean, as you said, he's going to be with us this afternoon at 2 o'clock. So if anyone wants any more information on fire safety, please tune in this afternoon. But once again, Cass, thank you ever so much, and we will hopefully see some of you this afternoon. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoyed this afternoon with Sean.
Will do. Thanks ever so much. Bye-bye.
Take care.